This podcast may not be suitable for young listeners.
Codename Wild Hunt, Operation Blood Eagle. Written by D.A Roberts and read to you by Cameron Buckner. Chapter 11, Where Eagles Dare. 14:30 hours, 15 May, Lake Nawalapi. Clark landed the plane and brought it back to the dock outside the hotel. Gray Eagle had not only located the hidden lair where the creatures hid by day, but he also located a massive clearing large enough for the teams to use as a landing zone, or LZ, for the target for the teams. Clark had been in contact with Allfather and been advised that Team Odin had landed in Buenos Aires 4 hours ago and prepared the choppers to bring in the Mimic units. They were already on their way to deploy the Mimics and secure the LZ. Team Odin would be the first to arrive and the last to leave. There was a reason they had all earned their Pathfinder badge. Team Orion, one of the West Coast teams, was going to come in right behind Team Odin and establish another landing zone on the outskirts of the village, complete with another set of Mimic units. That would be General Dalton's command center. They would hold that landing zone to prevent any escape by the Nazi personnel through the town. Since Analco was on a peninsula, it was going to be key that they block both directions to prevent them from escaping. Clark doubted that they would try to escape by water, due to the danger posed by the shark men. It was possible they could escape by air, but thus far they had been unable to locate a landing strip where they could lift from. They'd seen no sign of any aircraft, although Clark knew that Henderman collected World War II aircraft. The question was, where were they? In addition to the fleet of Chinooks who were bringing in the Mimic units, 8 Apache helicopters were accompanying them. They were to help establish air superiority before the assault on Analco. If any aircraft lifted from there, the Apaches had orders to shoot them down. The assault would launch immediately after the teams reached the ground. Team Uller was already cut orders to locate and eliminate the cat creatures. It would be their job to make sure the other teams weren't fighting Henderman's security forces and the cat creatures at the same time. "Tie us off," said Clark, nodding at Gray Eagle. Gray Eagle went out through the cockpit hatch and jumped across the dock. He tied them off and nodded at Clark, who shut down the engines and let Gray Eagle pull them the rest of the way to the dock before completely securing the lines. The others began climbing out the side hatch onto the dock. They had all changed back into their civilian clothes and stowed the weapon back in their bags. All of them were carrying the 50 GI Glocks concealed inside their waistbands. Too many things were in motion now for them to be caught off guard. As Clark was preparing to leave the cockpit, his phone buzzed. He checked it and found that the intel promised to them by Heinz had just been emailed to his account. He forwarded a copy to Saunders and General Dalton. They would immediately begin disseminating the information to the units that were committed to the assault. Crawling out of the hatch, he tossed his bag across to Gray Eagle. He saw movement in the water. It was only there for a second, but he was certain he'd seen a head sticking out just above the surface. It occurred to him that the shark men were watching them, trying to figure out what they were up to, and why they kept showing up where the fighting was. "What's next?" asked Gray Eagle as Clark jumped onto the dock. "We get ready for the others to arrive," said Clark. "Team Odin and the Mimics are in the air as we speak. They should arrive at the designated LZ in the next 2 hours. They're to get the Mimics online as fast as possible and hold the LZ for the others." "Won't that alert Henderman and the others?" asked Valkyrie. "Yes," said Clark. "We're hoping that we can contain them at Analco by cutting off both directions they could escape. Their only remaining options will be in the air or water. The Apaches will own the air and the Sharkmen own the water. I think we'll effectively have them hemmed in." "Well, let's hope so," said Runestone. "If they escape into the mountains, it might take years to find them. The Andes is one of the biggest mountain ranges on the planet." "Then we have to make sure it doesn't happen," said Clark. "And if it does, then we're going to have to find them. We can't let them escape so they can rebuild and do this again." "We've opened a can of worms," said Grey Eagle. "If they established a Nazi stronghold here in Argentina, then where else have they done it?" "Someone is going to have to start scouring the earth looking for them," said Valkyrie. "It's going to become a full-time job." "I feel sorry for whoever gets stuck with the job," said Clark. "Honestly, I just want to get back to hunting monsters." "You and me both, Hefe," said Runestone. "So how are they going to deal with the shark men in the water?" asked Valkyrie. "I gave them the name of a friend of mine," said Clark. "He's a former Navy SEAL who runs a private security company now. He's an expert on underwater threats. He came up with a method of using ultrasonic hydrophones to push them into a certain area of the lake. Once we know we've gotten them trapped, we're going to use depth charges to either eliminate them or force them to come up onto land. Then we deal with them the same way we would any other monster." "Yeah," said Runestone. "We put enough lead on our target to put them down hard. By the way, who's your friend that was a SEAL?" "His name is Clint Bruce," said Clark. "I met him right after I got out of the Army the first time. He asked me to come to Dallas to talk to a group of people, and he offered me a job, but I turned him down." "I've heard of that guy," said Runestone. "I never met him, but he's pretty well known in the community. Got a hell of a reputation. He played in the NFL for a while, I think. He's one tough motherfucker." "If he can help us eliminate those things," said Valkyrie, "then he's my new best friend." "All right, what's the plan now?" asked Raven. "We get our gear together, and we rendezvous with the rest of Team Odin when they hit the LZ, said Clark. "After that, we'll be part of the assault." "I thought it was going to take them a few days to mobilize," said Grey Eagle. "Well, it was," said Clark, "until they found out who was behind the creatures and POTUS got involved. Now it's a much bigger priority. They want this target taken out and arrests made if we can." "Won't they alert them by coming in with choppers?" asked Valkyrie. "They're coming in through the mountain passes on the west side of the lake," said Clark. "If everything goes right, they won't know anything's going on before the team is on the ground." "Well, what do we do then?" asked Valkyrie. "We get more ammo and equipment," said Clark, "and then we lead Team 2 and Team 4 to secure the intersection on the road just north of Analco. Teams 2 and 4 of Orion will blockade the road into town. If we time it right, we should effectively contain them. Then we hold them there until the rest of the team hits the ground." "Well, who's going after the cat creatures?" asked Raven. "Team Uller is going after them as soon as they hit the ground," said Clark. "All right," said Grey Eagle. "We have a battle plan in place. I would love to be dropping in with the team." "It's historic, man," said Runestone. "I don't think it's ever been done, much less with this many jumping. I've never heard of an op taking 9 teams to beat." "We're making team history," said Clark. "If this ever goes public, which I doubt, then we'll be changing world history." "I don't care about making history," said Valkyrie. "I just want to get through this mission. This is so far beyond anything we've done before. We're effectively invading part of Argentina." "Well, we do have their permission," said Runestone. "We have part of their permission," corrected Valkyrie. "We still have factions that are openly moving against us. That military intel team that met us at the airport had to have been sent by someone." "If we're lucky, they're being arrested as we speak," said Clark. "Well, let's not forget about the bugs in our hotel rooms, too," said Grey Eagle. "I'm willing to bet those bugs belong to the other government faction," said Clark. "Factions of the government," said Valkyrie. "More than one type of monster and the survivors of the Third Reich. This mission is insane." "We need to get our gear together," said Clark. "We need to load it into the SUV. I'll tell Ernesto that we're going back to the beach we went to yesterday. We can meet with the teams at the crossroads." 5 minutes later, they all met at the SUV. Clark got behind the wheel. Once everyone was inside, he drove out of the parking lot and headed for the highway to Analco. Immediately, Valkyrie opened the bags and started handing out weapons. Grey Eagle took Clark's AA-12 and checked the load before sliding into the seat next to Clark. Clark nodded in appreciation and then glanced at the message he'd received on the sat phone. 15 minutes until boots on the ground," said Clark. "Get your game faces on, people." Clark accelerated and kept the speed just above the posted limit, not wanting to draw too much attention. He hadn't seen any local police today, but this would not be a good time to get pulled over. They would have no choice but to shoot their way out of it. They couldn't allow themselves to be taken into custody. Too much was riding on their making the rendezvous. They drove without passing another vehicle for several minutes before Clark noticed something seemed off. He glanced around and saw the entire village seemed empty. No one was on the streets and the open-air market was abandoned. "What the fuck's going on?" asked Clark, nodding at the village. "Looks like the place was abandoned," said Grey Eagle. "How would they even know what was about to happen?" "I don't think it has anything to do with us," said Renstone, pointing at the lake. They all turned in that direction and saw several boats were floating empty on the lake. They were local fishermen who would not risk swimming in the frigid waters without reason. Clark slowed down and saw that one of the boats was sitting low in the water. It was lower in the stern than it should be. Then he realized what he was looking at. It looked like the small outboard motor had been ripped off the boat, allowing it to slowly fill with water. "It's the shark men," said Valkyrie. "They've started attacking boats on the lake." "Then where's everyone in the town?" asked Raven. "They're at the church," said Clark. "At least that's my guess. This place is still Roman Catholic. They're praying for God to remove the evil from the lake." "And for the souls of those who have been taken," whispered Runestone. Raven looked at him with concern on her face and put her hand on his. "You know," he said softly, "despite all the shit we've seen, I'm still Catholic. I was raised that way." "I didn't know you were religious," said Raven, looking at Runestone. "Most of the time I'm not," he replied, "but with everything that's happening now, I think prayers might be a good thing." "I would not disagree," said Grey Eagle. From the highway, they could see the beach that ran in front of Enlauco, but they couldn't see the house. Clark knew that was intentional to prevent too many curious eyes from watching what they were doing. Everything about the Enlauco estate was built around privacy. "ETA 10 minutes, said Grey Eagle, checking his watch. Clark pushed the accelerator down harder and headed out of town on the highway that would take them past the entrance to Enlauco. They wouldn't make any acknowledgments to the gate, continue to the rendezvous point. Time was quickly running low and things were about to start moving fast. When they saw the intersection come into view, Clark began slowing down. "All right," said Clark. "I'm going to pull to the side of the road and put the hood up. If anyone stops, we're just having engine trouble. If anyone comes from Enlauco, we might have to engage them." "You heard the man," said Grey Eagle, his NCO voice coming out loud and clear. "Let's move." "Valkyrie," said Clark, "I want you to find a position where you can watch the way we just came in. Stick close to us because I'm not convinced the cat creatures are out of the fight just yet. Until Team Uller neutralizes them, we can't assume they won't attack." "You got it, boss," she said, studying the area in search of a good place to set up her rifle. "We're close enough to Enlauco that they're going to hear the rotors," said Clark. "Once teams 2 and 4 hit the deck, we have to consider this is an active theater of operations." "I don't think we've got anything that can punch through those armored cars they drive," said Valkyrie. "Nothing I've got can punch it. Maybe the glass if I'm really lucky." "We need to start factoring that into our planning," said Clark. "We might want to upgrade your rifle." "You always know just what to get a girl," said Valkyrie, grinning. Clark rolled his eyes and started to say something when Runestone broke the silence. "Contact right!" he screamed, and brought his rifle to his shoulder. Clark spun quickly, bringing his AA-12 into firing position when he froze. Standing at the tree line was the same creature that had asked him for mercy during the fight at Enlauco. It wasn't rushing toward them or making any threatening movements. Seeing it in the light for the first time, he wasn't certain, but he thought the creature might be a female. It was difficult to tell with all the thick muscle. "Hold your fire!" roared Clark. Grey Eagle was already facing the creature, his weapon hanging from the single-point strap. Clark could see the muscles in his arms cording up and straining against the skin. His fingertips were already sprouting claws. Somehow, Grey Eagle was holding the transformation in check, but it seemed like it was just by the thinnest of strings. The Smilodon creature cocked its head to the side and held its hand out in front of it, palms facing them. It took a hesitant step forward, keeping its hands open where they could see them. Clark considered it for a moment before deciding. "Cover me," he said, lowering his weapon. Moving toward the creature, Clark let his AA-12 dangle from the strap around his neck. The creature watched him with caution, but didn't react as he grew closer. Clark stopped when they were still more than 10 meters apart. "I've got you covered," said Valkyrie. "I wouldn't get any closer, though." Clark stared at the creature for a moment before speaking. "Do you speak English?" he asked. The creature nodded affirmatively. "Good," said Clark. The creature nodded slowly in agreement. "You came to talk, right?" asked Clark. "All right," said Clark. "Let's talk." The creature nodded and took in a deep breath before releasing it slowly as it closed its eyes. Clark watched in surprise as the massive beast began changing back to human form. It was a smoother transition than he'd seen with Grey Eagle and Kodiak. He could see that his assessment had been correct, and it was a female. After a moment, a naked woman who looked to be of Native American descent instead of Hispanic stood before him. She stood roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall with dusky skin and tribal tattoos on her breasts, thighs, stomach, and upper arms. They appeared to be different animals, but drawn remarkably like the Mayan artwork he'd seen in museums. She was shockingly beautiful, with long black hair that hung to her slender waist. The nudity was distracting, and it took Clark a moment to recognize her. She was the waitress from the hotel restaurant. Clark quickly took off his uniform shirt and handed it to her. She smiled but seemed unfazed by her nudity. Accepting the shirt, she put it on. It was big enough that it covered everything, leaving her legs bare from just a few inches below her waist. "Thank you," she said, smiling. Okay," said Clark hesitantly. "How can I help you?" "My name is Rayan Huicapan," she said. "I'm the last of the Mapuche Indians." "Could all of you change forms?" asked Clark. "No," said Raven. "My grandmother was a powerful Jin Machi, a shaman of the spirits of nature. She passed it to my mother and then to me when my mother was killed by the Ekbalam." "What are the Ekbalam?" asked Clark. "Do you mean the panther creatures?" "Panthers?" asked Rayan. "They are black jaguars, not panthers." "That's right," said Clark. "They're not native to South America." "There were 4 clans who could change," said Rayan. 2 were pure evil. The Ekbalam and the Balam, both are jaguars, but the Ekbalam are black. The other 2 clans were fighting against them. They both were jinn. My clan and another who became El Tigre Sombre, the shadow tigers in your language. They were wiped out by the Ekbalam. "So why are you here?" asked Clark. "I am the last of my kind," she said. "I wish to fight beside you against the darkness that came to our soul when my grandmother was young, the evil ones that call themselves Nazis." Clark thought about it for a moment before speaking. "Is that why you were at the restaurant?" "No," she said. "I just happened to work here. That's how I caught the big one's scent the first time." She nodded at Grey Eagle. "Things are about to get very bad," said Clark. "There will be soldiers arriving soon, and we plan to take on those invaders at Analco. You might not want to be anywhere near this place when it starts." "I thought you were like the others," she said, ignoring Clark's suggestion. "But when you spared my life, I knew you were different. You were my only chance to help rid this place of their evil." "If I agree," said Clark, "you will have to follow our lead. If you don't, there's a good chance you could be killed in the crossfire." "I will follow you," she said, nodding. "I know you can work with my kind." She nodded at Grey Eagle. "This magic is strong," she said, "but it's different." Grey Eagle said nothing, but stared intently at Rayan. She met his gaze and held her head up high. "Use your senses," she urged. "You can tell if I'm one of the bad ones. You can sense if I'm lying." "Is she lying?" said Clark, glancing over at her. "I do not believe so," said Grey Eagle, "but it is too late to question it. I hear the helicopters coming now." Clark glanced at his sat phone and saw the message. "1 minute, folks," he shouted. "Turn on your comms." Everyone activated their radios and heard the clicks as the encryption system linked up with the rest of the team. It was the clearest indication that Team Odin was close. "Thunder God to Allfather," said Clark. "Go for Allfather," said Saunders. "We're in position and ready to begin," said Clark. "The road is secure. We can confirm target is in the nest. Over." "Copy, Thunder God," said Saunders. "Blood Eagle is a go." "Asgard to all units," said General Dalton. "Blood Eagle is a go." "Say again, Blood Eagle is a go." Above the trees, 2 Chinook helicopters came screaming in at barely above treetop level. They both flared out and hovered over the intersection. Clark could barely hear his own voice with the 2 twin-rotor choppers hovering right above him. The only indication of trouble was when Grey Eagle dropped his weapon and started to shift forms. Turning in that direction, he saw close to 50 of the Ekballam and the Ballam erupting from the trees and racing toward them. Rayan stripped off her shirt and began transforming. Grey Eagle roared loud enough to be heard above the choppers, and Clark could feel the power of it in his chest. Not for the first time, Clark was grateful that Grey Eagle was on their side. "Thunder God to Allfather," shouted Clark into his mic. "Troops in contact." "Say again, troops in contact." He wasn't sure if they had heard him, but it was too late to do anything about it anyway. They were on their own with enemies on both sides. "Fuck," he hissed, not hearing a response from the radio. Rayan transformed and stood beside Grey Eagle, facing the charging cat creatures. She was a head shorter than him, but matched his ferocity with her massive fangs bared. Clark knew that they had to hold off the cat creatures long enough for teams 2 and 4 to get on the ground. It was almost impossible for them to fight from inside the chopper. Valkyrie rolled over to face the attack instead of the road and began lining up targets. Clark began firing as he moved toward the creatures, keeping them at bay while the teams deployed. Using the comms or shouting commands was useless with the choppers directly overhead. He just had to trust his team to do what they were trained to do. He wasn't worried because he trusted them all with his life. 2 creatures were rushing right toward him, and he emptied the AA-12 into the first creature, punching a hole in the middle of its chest large enough to see daylight through. And when the weapon clicked empty, Clark knew he was now in melee range. In an instant, he drew the bounty on his hip and yanked free his boarding axe. With the axe in his left hand and the bounty in his right, he launched himself at the second creature. Above them, a thunderous roar shattered the cacophony of battle. Clark slashed the creature across the abdomen, nearly disemboweling the creature as he slid past it on his knees, narrowly avoiding the creature's claws. Glancing up, he saw something that he would never forget. He wasn't even sure he believed what he was seeing. At the back of the first Chinook, the ramp was fully extended, and at the end of the ramp stood Staff Sergeant Cody Tapuki, call sign Kodiak. He was wearing a loincloth and had 2 of the massive packs for the XM214 minigun strapped to his back, with 1 weapon in each hand. He stepped off the platform and shifted to his bear form in mid-air, landing with an earth-shaking boom. He was fully transformed and holding the XM214s like pistols. Roaring in fury, he began advancing toward the cat creatures, using the miniguns with deadly effect. Ropes dropped from the choppers and troops began deploying as fast as they could safely go. The creatures were pushing closer to them, but so far they had managed to hold them back. The element of surprise was gone now. Everyone at Analco might not have heard the choppers, but there is no way they wouldn't hear the firefight that had just erupted a few miles down the road from their gate. "Push him back!" screamed Clark. He wasn't sure anyone heard him. "Fuck!" he hissed, ducking another creature that had just swiped at his face with its claws. Time seemed to stand still as he saw the tableau unfolding in front of him. 2 creatures were bearing down on him like freight trains, but another movement caught his eye. Valkyrie was sighting in on a target and didn't see the creature that was leaping at her from the trees. And in that instant, Clark knew he could save himself or save her. Doubt never entered his mind as he decided. Whirling to his left, he threw the boarding axe with all the force he could muster, and it flipped end over end through the air as if in slow motion. His aim had been good, and he watched the blade bury to the handle in the side of the beast's head, and it fell in a heap and slid to a stop just 3 feet short of Valkyrie. She was so focused on her shot that she never saw it coming for her. Clark felt the claws of at least one of the beasts dig into his ribs as it landed on its back and took him to the ground. Shifting the large blade of the bounty as he fell, he tucked it beneath his right arm. The force of the fall drove the blade through the chest of the creature on his back just as he felt the hot breath and sharp teeth touch the back of his neck. He grunted as he hit the ground with so much weight on his back, and he tried to free himself but couldn't force the heavy creature off his back. He was pinned and only barely able to move his head, and out of the corner of his eye he could see the second creature reaching for his face with its claws extended. And just before it reached him there was a boom, and the beast's head exploded in a fountain of gore and bone. Valkyrie had just earned another kill. He recognized her handiwork. Shoving with all his might, he was starting to painfully lift the creature when it came off him suddenly. He rolled onto his back and he drew his gunner's mate knife and prepared himself for an attack, but instead of a creature, he was looking up into the grinning face of Staff Sergeant Franklin Morehouse Margolin. "Goddamn, boss," he said, holding out his hand. "You okay? Say something. Cat got your tongue?" Clark had no choice but to laugh as he took the extended hand and was hauled to his feet. He shook his head and he retrieved his bounty from the chest of the creature and nodded his appreciation to Margolin. Margolin casually put 2 rounds into the creature's head just to make sure it stayed on the ground. "Bad kitty," said Margolin. "Stay the fuck down there." Clark suddenly realized that the roar of the rotors was now fading away, and both teams were on the ground and the tide of battle had changed. A few remaining cat creatures were trying to escape but were being taken down by the precision fire of Valkyrie and Sergeant Alejandro de la Cruz of the Peruvian Special Forces, call sign Scald. Clark glanced around and he could see that fighting was all but finished. It was time to secure their object and blockade this road. He looked around and saw there were several wounded, but it didn't look like there had been any fatalities. Most of the wounds looked like they would just likely be interesting scars. Kodiak walked out of the trees, cradling Rayan in his thickly muscled arms. She'd taken a nasty wound to her left thigh and abdomen. They were healing slowly, but he wasn't taking any chances. He carried her to a medic and lay her on the ground, kneeling beside her. "Are you all right?" he rumbled, looking into her intense green eyes. "I am now," she said, her voice purring. "Thanks to you, my grandmother told me that my fate was tied to a bear. I never knew what she meant by that." "She's healing rapidly," said Caduceus. "She should be fine in a few minutes." Kodiak nodded his thanks and continued to stare into those strange green eyes. "All right, folks," shouted Clark. "Let's get this road blocked. Kodiak and Gragel, see if you can knock a few trees down and block off this section right here." "Duty calls," rumbled Kodiak. "I'll join you in a minute," purred Rayan. Kodiak stood and headed for the trees, looking for trees large enough to block the road and to provide cover for the team. "Would you look at that?" said Gideon, lighting up a cigar and nodding at the sky. They all looked up to see numerous mammoth aircraft flying over. Out of the back of a C-17 Globemaster, they watched as paratroopers launched themselves into the sky. Moments later, their chutes began deploying. They weren't jumping with the traditional round chutes. They were using the Army Advanced Air Ram Parachute Systems, RA-1, using their superior mobility to guide them to the LZ. Clark noted that the weather was perfect for an airborne drop, and with the mobility of the chutes and the large LZ, they should all be safe on the ground within minutes. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy at the men and women who got to jump today over such a beautiful scenery. "Fucking A," said Margolin, pumping his fist in the air. "If that's not the most beautiful sight you've ever seen, then I don't know what is." Gray Eagle and Kodiak stacked several large trees, cutting off all access to the road. And immediately, teams 2 and 4 began setting up firing positions behind the trees. "Thunder God to all, Father," said Clark. "Objective is secure, over." "Copy, Thunder God," said Saunders. "Stand by to initiate Phase 2. Out." Chapter 12. The Eagle has landed. 1800 hours, 15 May, Lake Nawalapi. Clark and other senior staff of Teams 2 and Team 4 stood behind the barricade. Although this was several of the new members' first deployment with the team, they had already proven themselves in battle with the cat creatures. "Both mimic units are online," said Clark. "We have full command and control functions. Once the command is given, we're to proceed to the gate and breach the perimeter." "Just us?" asked Murdoch. "No," said Clark. "We're meeting up with 2 elements from Team Orion. I've got operational command. Hernandez, you're Team XO." "Got it," said Hernandez. "Mind if we join your little powwow?" asked Matthias Giovanni, walking up with his brother, the priest. "Would it stop you if I said yes?" asked Clark, a note of anger in his tone. "Probably not," said Matthias, smiling. "By the way, Major," said Father Marcus, "our sister told me to give you something." Clark looked quizzically at the priest. Despite being a priest, he was wearing a full combat load, except that instead of carrying guns, he was loaded with his sword, along with numerous knives and throwing blades. Clark was more than a little concerned, since he knew their sister was psychic. They called her an oracle, but it amounted to the same thing. She could predict events even before they happened. "What's that?" asked Clark. Father Marcus handed him a playing card. Clark glanced at it with a confusion on his face. It was just a simple card from a standard deck, but flipping it over, he noted that it was the Ace of Spades. "Is there any kind of explanation?" asked Clark, giving brothers Giovanni an annoyed look. "He said it would be your new nickname," said Father Marcus. Clark shook his head and casually slipped the card into his shirt pocket. "Whatever," he said, turning back to the group. "My apologies for the interruption. Aren't you the slightest bit curious about that?" asked Matthias. "Look," said Clark, his temper flaring. "I don't have time for this. The only reason I'm putting up with the 2 of you at all is the Vatican rammed it down our throats. Neither of you are trained military. You refuse to follow protocols and seem to think that you can come and go as you please. You don't even pay cursory attention to the chain of command. If I can't trust you to follow my orders in the field, then neither of you is worth a shit to this team. Does that clear things up for you?" Father Marcus stepped back as if he'd been slapped in the face, but Matthias just smiled that strange, sardonic smile of his. Women seemed to find it irresistible. It just made Clark want to punch him in the mouth. He resisted the urge, but it took some effort. "My apologies," said Father Marcus. "It was never our intent to undermine your authority. We're just used to operating with a certain degree of autonomy." "Well, that might work on the Vatican team," said Clark, "but this is a military unit, and in the field we all depend on each other. Whenever one person, or in this case 2, don't follow orders and just do their own thing, that endangers us all. So that leaves us at an impasse. I need to be able to count on you doing as I tell you. If that is something you fail to understand, then I have no use for you. I will not endanger this entire operation because the 2 of you want to do things your way." "I thought your orders were to accommodate us," asked Matthias. Clark started to take a step toward him, anger flashing on his face. Now, said Matthias. "Temper, temper." Gideon stepped out from behind Clark and drove a fist into Matthias's face, with a blow that cracked like a baseball bat striking a side of beef. Matthias flew nearly 6 feet before he hit the ground, his nose broken and blood pouring from both nostrils. "Listen to me, you little shit," snarled Gideon. "He might not be able to hit you, but I damn sure will. You 2 better get your shit together, and I mean right fucking now, or I swear I will send you both back to Rome in a goddamn suitcase." Everyone froze. That was the most profanity they had ever heard Gideon use at one time. He rarely swore, let alone let his temper flare. Matthias just lay on his back, holding his nose. His eyes were wide open in shock. Father Marcus quickly stepped between Gideon and Matthias. "That's enough," he said, holding his hands out. "Please, I apologize for my brother's behavior. He likes to push people's buttons. He also has the uncanny ability to push things too far at the worst possible time." "Get your shit together," snarled Clark. "I've got half a mind to put both of you on a chopper and send you back to base." Matthias spat bloody phlegm on the ground as he slowly got to his feet. He was glaring death at Gideon. "Proditoris factus ad mortem," Matthias said, glaring at Gideon. "Age quod aegis," replied Gideon, meeting his gaze. Matthias went for his gun while Gideon reached for the hilt of the gladius on his hip. Before Matthias could make a move, massive hands wrapped around his wrist and throat. It was Malachi Beer. The gigantic Israeli lifted Matthias off the ground like he didn't weigh an ounce. "I think it is time we were formally introduced, yes?" he said, glaring into Matthias's face. "I am Malachi Beer. I was fortunate to be chosen for this assignment. My code name was translated so that I could use it as a call sign here. Banamor means executioner. That was what I was in my own unit. I was who they sent when terrorists needed to die, with absolute certainty. Many perished at my hand, and the last thing they saw before death was the view you are seeing now." There was silence in the group. Matthias's feet were easily a foot off the ground, and his eyes were wide open in fear. Malachi narrowed his eyes and glared directly into Matthias's. To Matthias, it felt like they were boring into his soul. "Our mission," said Malachi, "is to finally put an end to some of the worst Nazi filth that ever lived. I do not plan on letting you ruin our chances. Now you can watch your mouth and do as you are told, and if you choose to do anything else, I will put you to sleep, and you will not wake up for many hours. The Major is trying to lay out our battle plan. You can listen quietly, but do not interrupt. This kind of behavior is exactly why Israel does not work with the Vatican. You arrogantly assume that you're in charge in all things. This simply is not the case. Do you understand?" He glared into Matthias's eyes for a few moments before setting him onto the ground. "There," said Malachi, patting Matthias on the cheek like a child. "We can all be friends now. We have an understanding, yes?" Matthias said nothing. "I told you something like this would happen if you kept pushing," said Father Marcus, glaring at Matthias. "If you get us thrown off this team, the Archbishop will not be happy with you. His Holy Eminence will not be happy either." Gideon never moved a muscle. His hand was still wrapped around the hilt of his gladius, and his gaze didn't falter. "Gideon," said Clark, "stand down." Gideon narrowed his eyes at Matthias before releasing his grip on the gladius and stepping back. "My apologies, Major," said Gideon, nodding at Clark. "Do you wish to file charges against Sergeant Major Gideon for striking you?" asked Clark, gritting his teeth. "No," said Matthias, wiping blood from his nose. "That's good," said Clark. "I'll consider the matter dropped. Now, is there something I can do for the two of you?" "Again," said Father Marcus, "I apologize for our behavior. We want to be part of this team. I will make sure we do a better job of adjusting to the structure of this unit." "And you?" asked Clark, glaring at Matthias. "No, sir," said Matthias through gritted teeth. "I'm sorry I pushed things too far." Clark stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "Fine," he said. "You're dismissed. You will be briefed when I finish discussing our orders with the senior staff." The brothers moved away and headed toward the rear of the group. As they were walking, Matthias started to say something when he was cut off by Father Marcus. "Don't you ever learn?" he demanded, glaring at Matthias. "We're here under direct order from the Secretary General of the Order. If you screw this up, they might throw us out of the order." "Well, is that such a bad thing?" asked Matthias, giving Marcus a dirty look. "Only if you think they won't revoke Grandfather's indulgence," said Marcus. "You might not only ruin everything for you, you could do it for all of us." Matthias looked like he had been struck again, and he stopped in his tracks and looked at his feet. "Fuck," he said. I never thought of that. That old bastard would do it too. That's the problem, dear brother, said Marcus. You never think of the consequences of your actions. You of all people should know that hell is a real place. You were just punched in the face by living proof. He is no demon, countered Matthias sourly. No, he just stabs Christ in the side, snapped Marcus. That kind of makes faith irrelevant, don't you think? He's proof that Christ was here. Do you want to tempt that kind of fate? Why would you even try? Christ cursed him to remain here until he returns. Do you think you can interfere with that? Are you so arrogant that you think you can undo what Christ himself wrought? Matthias looked like he was going to say something else when Valkyrie walked up. She tossed Matthias a single round from her rifle. It was a large, heavy, solid core round etched with magic runes and coated with silver, packed in the tip with tungsten and silver nitrate. What's this for? He asked, looking at her confused. Just a friendly reminder, she said, smiling darkly. If you make a move on Gideon or Clark, then I promise you won't see the next one coming. She turned and walked away without another word. Way to go, moron, said Father Marcus. That woman can put a bullet through a gopher's eye at 1,000 yards. You really do have a way with people, you know. Matthias looked at the round in his hand, turning it over slowly. It occurred to him that he'd pushed his luck with a lot of people over the years. He'd been threatened by some of the nastiest, most dangerous people on the planet. None of the threats scared him as much as the one laying in the palm of his hand. Not just because of her reputation, but because he could never know when or where that round might come for him. My apologies for the distraction, said Clark, turning back to the others. We'll have to work on team cohesiveness before our next deployment. Gideon glanced at Clark with an apologetic look on his face, but said nothing. The rest of teams Odin, Uller, Scotty, Tyr, and Freya will be moving into position along the boundaries to Elnalco, said Clark. Team Uller found that most of the cat creatures were gone when they arrived at the coordinates that Gregel gave them. Looks like we wiped out most of them when they hit us. Teams Orion, Apollo, Artemis, and Diana will be covering the south end of Elnalco. That's good, said Murdoch. That gives us another entire team to throw at these assholes. It's time to put an end to them, once and for all. It will not be that easy, cautioned Malachi. Do not underestimate this foe. They are responsible for the deaths of 6 million of my people. They have had more than 70 years to fortify this place. He's right, said Clark. I know for a fact they have an underground safe room as well as the scientific facilities. Since we never saw a building that looked like it was used for that, I think it's probably safe to assume that it's underground too. This entire area could be riddled with underground bunkers and strongholds. We know from the intel that Heinz gave us that there are at least 500 security personnel, or as he called him, the Wehrmacht. There's no way they're all above ground or we'd have seen them on the satellite images. Thermal imaging agrees with that assessment, said Hernandez. The entire compound is not only connected by tunnels, but there are also extensive underground facilities. One section even seems to connect to the lake. An underwater access point? Asked Clark. It appears so, said Hernandez. Possibly an escape route. We can't rule out the possibility of some sort of submersible vehicle. They'd be fools to use it, said Clark. With the sharkmen out of control, going out into the lake in a sub would be suicide. There's more, said Hernandez. Thermal indicates an underground airstrip. It looks like they can launch and retrieve aircraft from an access way in a cliff face on the far side of the compound. The Apaches are covering it just in case they try to escape that way. All right, said Clark. We've got them bottled up inside their own perimeter. We need to make our move before they decide to punch their way out. Major, if I may, said Gideon, nodding at Clark. Go ahead, said Clark. According to the satellite images, said Gideon, there should be a bunker about 300 meters due west of here. All right, said Clark. What are you proposing? That we take a team and hit that bunker, said Gideon. It'll have to be a smaller team. All the bunkers are connected by tunnels. If we can crack that bunker open, we can get direct access to the underground facility, while the rest of the team hits the gate," said Clark. "That's what I was thinking, sir," said Gideon. "I think that's a good idea," said Clark. "Let me get on the horn and run it by Allfather. If they like it, we'll leave most of Team 2 and Team 4 here at the roadblock and let Team Uller lead the assault on the gate. I'll take Team 2 into the complex." "I have to agree with the plan," said Hernandez. "It's going to be a nasty fight, but I think it gives us the best shot at penetrating their facility before they have time to move their troops from the perimeter." "If I know Allfather," said Clark, "we're going to get a green light. Start making the preparations." "Yes, sir," said Hernandez. "All right, let's get the ball rolling," said Clark. "Dismissed. We'll meet up again after I talk to Allfather." "Talk to me about what?" said a voice from behind them. Clark glanced back to see Allfather leading the remainder of Team Odin and all of Team Uller into the perimeter. "It's nice of you to join us, sir." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," said Saunders. "Besides, Colonel Boudreaux has operational command of the Mimics. He's got a security team of Army Rangers assigned to him from JSOC. Team Odin started this fight. We're going to finish it. So what did you need to talk to me about?" Clark spent the next few minutes briefing Saunders on the plan. While he was talking, they were joined by CSM Hammond, who simply nodded and held out his hand. Clark tossed him a can of chewing tobacco without missing a beat. When he finished, Saunders looked at him for a long moment. "And you're going to take Team 2 into the rabbit hole," said Saunders. "Well, that's the plan, sir," said Clark, grinning. "I hope you realize just how heavy the fighting's going to get down there," said Saunders. "That's where they'll have all the HVTs. Are you sure Team 2 is enough?" "Well, if we could take Team 4 with us," said Clark. "It might get a bit crowded, but that would double our firepower." "Then do it," said Saunders. "Make that happen. Everyone gets with the armorer and re-equip. You'll want suppressed weapons below ground." "Copy that," said Clark. "We'll be ready to move in 30 minutes. "All right," said Saunders. "We're going to cut the perimeter fence at the same time you do and follow the road that runs along the perimeter right to the main gate. We're leaving the heavy weapons teams here at the roadblock." "Do we have all teams in place?" asked Clark. "We're blockading every possible exit except for the lake," said Saunders. "The Apaches are covering that. Unless they try to launch a submersible, we can cover everything. Using a submersible wouldn't be useful since they can't control the shark men. I don't see that being a viable option for them. The risk is too high." Gideon walked up and handed Clark one of the SIG NGSWARs with the L3 LWTS optics mounted. The barrel was already fitted with a suppressor. Clark nodded his appreciation as he clipped the weapon to his single-point sling. "The teams are all outfitted," said Gideon, handing Clark a SIG M17 pistol that had been fitted with a suppressor. Clark clipped the holster to his plate carrier and kept the 50 GI Glock conversion on his belt. "Think I'm going to hang on to this 50, said Clark. "You never know when you're going to have something with a little more punch to it." "I'm sending Bifrost with you," said Saunders. "You're going to need a combat engineer to blast through the concrete on that bunker." "That's a good call, sir," said Clark. "We're ready to roll on your command." Saunders nodded and turned to the team. "All right, folks," yelled Saunders. "You've all been briefed. Form up and let's move out." There was a line of heavy machine guns interspersed with Mark 19 grenade launchers along both directions of approach on the road, with enough riflemen to cover any angle. The road was closed, and they weren't going to breach it with anything less than a tank company. Team Odin split into two groups, with Clark leading Teams 2 and 4. Saunders took command of Team 1 of Odin and Teams 1, 2, and 4 of Team Uller. As they were starting to head in different directions, Clark caught the attention of Team Uller's commander. "Hey, Slayton!" yelled Clark. Major Nicholas Slayton, call sign Archer, turned and walked over. "What's up, Thunder God?" he asked. "Watch Saunders back for me," said Clark. "Keep him safe." "I thought that's what I was for," said CSM Hammond with a raspy chuckle. Clark reached into his cargo pocket and tossed Hammond a can of chew. "You think that'll last you until this is done?" asked Clark. Maybe, said Hammond, but I've got a few good cubanos for us to smoke when this is over and we're back together. Well, that's a deal, said Clark. I've got a bottle of bourbon in my bag that'll go great with those cigars. That's why you're my favorite, said Hammond, winking at Clark. Do I get invited to this party? Asked Slayton. Hell yeah, said Hammond. You're almost family, kind of like Odin's bastard stepchild. And they both chuckled. You all be careful, said Clark. This is going to be a hell of a fight. Watch your ass, son, said Hammond. You're going into a snake's den. What's that quote from Ricky Tikki Tavi? Asked Clark with a wide grin. And very few mongooses, however wise and old they may be, care to follow a cobra into its hole. Don't get bit, said Hammond. Clark clasped hands with Hammond and Slayton. See you assholes on the other side, said Clark. They headed their separate ways, moving into the trees at the edge of the road. They found the perimeter fence less than 10 yards inside. Clark nodded at Bifrost. The Staff Sergeant Paul LeBlanc was a U.S. Army-trained combat engineer from the 15th Engineer Combat Battalion. He was also incredibly good at his job. In seconds, Bifrost bypassed the electrical current and cut through the section of fence large enough for the team to pass 3 at a time. Clark and Gideon went through the first with Murdoch on their heels. They instantly took up defensive positions to cover the others as they passed through. Once the team was through, Clark nodded at Bifrost. How long until they know the fence has been breached, he asked. If I did it right, answered Bifrost, they won't. All right, let's move, said Clark. Murdoch, you've got point with Grey Eagle and Margolin. Go. They slipped silently into the forest. It only took a few moments before they reached the patrol road that ran around the entire property of Analco. Grey Eagle and the others went to one knee when they reached the road. Clark slipped up beside them, glancing at the map readout on his wrist computer. If the map is right, said Clark, the bunker should be about 300 meters to the right if we follow this road. If we follow the road, cautioned Grey Eagle, they'll see us coming. But if we go through the trees, I can bring us up on their blind side. We've got cameras on the road, whispered Murdoch. If we take them out, they'll know that we're here. Wait one, said Clark, reaching for his mic. Thunder God to All-Father, he said. We're in position. Ready, on my mark, was the reply. Clark motioned for both Valkyrie and Sergeant Alejandro de la Cruz, call sign Skull, to come up. On my mark, he whispered. Take out both cameras, suppressed weapons only. They both nodded and brought up their rifles, sighting in on the cameras. You ready? Whispered Clark into the mic. Go, said Saunders. Now, said Clark, loud enough for the shooters to hear him. The two suppressed coughs erupted and you could hear both bolts come back. Both shooters recovered their expended brass. Clark visually verified that both cameras had been destroyed. A few hundred meters away to their left, they heard unsuppressed rifles ring out. Saunders was the bait, covering the covert insertion of Clark's team. Motioning for everyone to take cover, they watched as 2 of the armored German AMPVs raced by, heading for the sound of the gunshots. They passed by Clark's team without even slowing down. Clark counted down from 20, listening as the 2 vehicles opened fire on the other team. The firefight was over in seconds, and Saunders had been waiting for them. Let's move, said Clark. In groups of 2, they began racing across the narrow road and into the trees on the other side. Grey Eagle navigated by instinct and was taking them on a curved path to the bunker. If they could get close enough without them knowing that they were there, they stood a good chance of getting inside without them knowing it. If they didn't, then Bifrost was going to make them an entrance. Grey Eagle crouched low and checked the air. There was something different in this area. It wasn't the same as the cat creatures, but it was oddly familiar. Something not quite human was nearby. Whatever it wasn't close. He hoped that it didn't sense him the same way he sensed it. What's wrong? Whispered Murdoch. It's nothing I can explain, said Grey Eagle. It's just a feeling. Well, whatever it is, whispered Murdoch, let's hope it's friendly. That bunker should be right through those trees, according to the map. "Let's go," whispered Margolin. "I want to get me a German boot knife." "Shut up, Margolin," whispered Murdoch, shaking his head. Chapter 13. Snake's Lair. 1930 hours 15 May, Analco. Gray Eagle crept through the trees, making hardly a whisper of noise. He'd motioned for the others to take a knee and wait for his signal before they tried to approach the bunker. He crouched low and peered through the branches of a coniferous tree. He hunkered beneath the branches at the base of the tree, using the natural camouflage to his advantage. Breathing shallow, he watched for movement. The bunker was plain to see once you were close, but they had done an excellent job of camouflaging it from the air and the front side. They had planted trees and pulled them with ropes until they grew in the desired formation, completely covering the bunker from above. It had taken years, but it was ingenious. Modern thermal technology made it a moot point, but had they been using the equivalent of World War II technology, they would have never seen it. The thought occurred to Gray Eagle that despite the Nazis using advanced technology, they were going to great lengths to keep things low-tech here at Analco. That struck him as odd since it also limited their ability to defend themselves. He made a mental note to tell Major Clark what he suspected just in case it might be important. Watching patiently, Gray Eagle saw movement at the back of the bunker. There was a steel door set into thick concrete, and it was opening. The man that walked out was tall, nearly as big as Kodiak. He had to be nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall and was rippling with muscle. His blond hair was cut militarily short, and his blue eyes shone like beacons. It was that movement that Gray Eagle realized the creature he'd sensed was standing right in front of him, less than 20 yards away. While the man wore military fatigue pants, military boots, and a green tank top T-shirt, he carried no firearm. He looked around the area and seemed to either not notice Gray Eagle or failed to detect his presence. Turning his back, the man walked over to the edge of the trees on the other side of the bunker and opened his fly. He urinated into the thick grass, and then the man leaned his head back and sighed contently. Gray Eagle considered eliminating him, but he hesitated, wondering if the rounds he had in his rifle would put him down. He didn't know enough about what he was to make that call. It might only serve to anger the man. He wanted to be certain of a clean, quiet kill before he risked exposing them. The man finished urinating and buttoned his fly, and turning around, he froze and stared directly at where Gray Eagle was hiding. Holding his breath, Gray Eagle froze so no movement would give away his position. The man cocked his head from side to side as if studying the spot. Gray Eagle could see the confusion on the man's face. It was clear that he sensed something but couldn't figure out what it was. Gray Eagle felt sweat running down his face and onto the tip of his nose, but still he held completely motionless. Painfully slow, he shifted his fingers on the grip of his rifle. His finger moved a millimeter at a time, slowly moving onto the trigger. His thumb found the selector lever, but he knew that it was going to make a noise. It might almost be imperceptible, but he had little doubt that it would give away his position. "Come on, Hans!" yelled a voice from inside the bunker. "Lock that fucking door before someone gets in." The man's concentration was broken, and he turned to face the door. "I'm coming," snapped Hans. "I thought I heard something." Gray Eagle knew he had to act quickly before they shut that door. If he could catch the bunker open, they could get inside the underground facility without anyone being the wiser. Click! The sound of the selector lever moving to auto cracked like thunder. At least it did for Gray Eagle. Hans heard it too, and his head snapped around in an instant. He looked directly at the spot where Gray Eagle crouched, and before he could open his mouth, Gray Eagle opened fire. The suppressed SIG NGSWAR began coughing out high-velocity death as the belt-fed weapon came to life. The first dozen rounds rocked Hans back on his feet, but he didn't fall. He only staggered backward, shaking like he was dancing. Grey Eagle continued to fire as he stepped out of the bushes and kept the fire concentrated on Hans' chest. After nearly 30 rounds, it was clear that he wasn't going down. There was a strange bluish blood oozing from the wounds in Hans' mouth, but he didn't fall. Instead, Grey Eagle could see the wounds beginning to force out the projectiles and heal. Hans' skin began to turn a mottled gray, and he started getting bigger. "You're going to have to do better than that," said Hans, his voice gurgling with blood in his lungs. Hans began to get bigger, and Grey Eagle saw gill slits forming on both sides of his neck. His face began to elongate, looking not quite like a shark, but not like a human either. They had moved quickly into the second phase, and that meant it was highly unlikely that they would recover Heinz before he'd been put through the experiment. A roar like thunder exploded from the trees behind Grey Eagle. He expected to see either Kodiak or Rayan rush out of the trees and challenge the gigantic shark man. It took Grey Eagle a moment to realize that hadn't been the roar of a living creature. That was Valkyrie's rifle. The massive 45-70 round slammed into the forehead of the Hans shark and exploded the head into a fountain of gray matter and bluish gore. Hans stumbled back before falling to his knees and then onto his face. Running to the door, Grey Eagle opened fire into the bunker just as an arm came out attempting to pull the door shut. The man was no monster. He was flesh and blood, and the rounds had no problem shredding him since he wasn't wearing body armor. Grey Eagle rushed inside and noticed that Margolin and Murdoch were right on his heels. There was a brief exchange of fire, and 3 more of the Germans went down in bloody heaps. As the suppressed weapons fire came to a sudden end, Grey Eagle could see the carnage around the room and nodded at the others. "Clear," he said. "Clear," echoed Margolin and Murdoch. "Go back and tell the Major to bring everyone in," said Grey Eagle, nodding at Margolin. "We secured the bunker." Walking outside, Margolin saw the arms on the shark man begin to twitch. "Fuck me," he whispered, and put a long suppressed burst into the beast's head. "Stay the fuck down." The others began emerging from the trees and headed for the bunker. Clark paused long enough to take out his bounty blade and lop the head from the shark man. "Heal that, you son of a bitch," he said, wiping the bluish blood onto the dead man's T-shirt. Soon everyone was filing inside. Clark looked around and found a small armory. Several sets of body armor neatly stacked, and helmets sat beside them. It was hot and humid inside the bunker, making it obvious why they'd taken it off. None of them expected a direct assault on the bunker. They were complacent, and that would work to their advantage. "Murdoch," said Clark, "how's your German?" "Nichts," answered Murdoch. "Grab all of their radios," said Clark. "I want a few of us that speak German monitoring their frequency. If they stay focused on the assault above ground, they might overlook us until it's too late." "Boss," said Margolin, "you might want to take a look at this." Margolin was motioning at the steps that led down into the connecting tunnel. Clark followed him and found that it wasn't just a small tunnel that troops could walk through. It was almost as wide as a road and 10 feet high, with a spot to turn around. It only led back toward the main part of the compound. This had to be the end of the line for this section of the tunnel. There were parking nooks where they had 2 electric passenger carts that could hold 6 people. Well, that would only accommodate 12 of them, so he ruled them out. It would spread the team too thin. They needed to stick together. "All right," said Clark. "We've got a clear direction of travel. We'll follow this tunnel until we reach the hub. Now, I'm sure that there will be a central hub that leads to all the bunkers on this end of the property." "What do we do about the other bunkers?" asked Murdoch. "Once we're clear," said Clark, "we give the Apaches the green light to start taking them out." "That might take them out of position to cover the airstrip," cautioned Murdoch. "I think we can spare 1 Apache," said Clark. "There are 8 out there. Surely 7 can cover the airstrip." "Unless they're carrying bunker busters," said Murdoch, "the Apaches might not have enough firepower to punch through a concrete bunker." "Let me see what they've got," said Clark, reaching for his radio. "Thunder God to Valhalla," said Clark. "This is Valhalla Actual," came the voice of Colonel Boudreaux. Go ahead. We've reached our first objective, said Clark. Requesting air support. Begin targeting the bunkers. Over. Negative, said Boudreaux. Asgard has other assets tasked for those objectives. Proceed to the next objective and advise when you're clear of the bunker. Ghost Rider gunships are inbound. Proceed to Object 2. You have 5 minutes to reach it. Over. Affirm, said Clark. Well, Charlie Mike and advise when clear. Thunder God out. What did he say? Asked Murdoch. He said Asgard has other plans and to get our ass moving, said Clark. Let's get clear before they bring down some serious firepower on these bunkers. Valhalla advises that AC-130 J2 Ghost Riders are targeting the bunkers. Fuck, said Margolin with a wry grin. I don't want to be anywhere close to a bunker when those 105s click off. Well, let's move, said Clark. Gragel, Beer, Davidson, take point. Kodiak, you're right behind him. Gragel nodded at Malachi and Warrant Officer Noah Davidson. Gragel knew their files. Davidson was on loan to the team from the British Special Reconnaissance Regiment. Although he was very reserved, Davidson had proven to be highly competent during training, remaining cool under stress. There was something about him that Gragel couldn't quite put his finger on, something mysterious. That would be for another time, but right now they had bigger problems. Cody and Rayan moved up behind the point team. Cody was once again carrying the massive minigun, but only one. He wasn't planning on shifting forms in this tunnel, and even his incredible strength alone wasn't enough to carry both for long. He glanced over at Rayan and she smiled at him, placing a reassuring hand on his forearm. She had been given a uniform and armor, but she carried no weapons. She assured them that she didn't know how to use them and was planning on shifting forms as soon as they contacted the enemy. Let's move, said Malachi. As they headed off, Clark watched them for a moment. He knew the big Israeli would be highly motivated to complete this mission. This might very well be the most important mission of his entire career. Clark just hoped that he'd remain focused on the mission instead of revenge. That was something he'd have to watch. Murdoch, said Clark, nodding. You take Gideon and Raven and watch our 6. I'll stick close to the middle. I want the Giovannis with me. Everyone else take your assigned positions. As everyone began fanning out, Matthias leaned close to Marcus. See, he whispered, he wants us with him. I think that's so he can shoot you himself, said Marcus, if you give him a reason. Fuck, said Matthias, I hadn't thought of that. Let's move, people, said Clark. We've got a lot of distance to cover and exactly 20 minutes to do it. Let's move. They proceeded down the long tunnel, moving quickly. Clark was monitoring the radio that they'd confiscated but heard no traffic indicating that their presence in the bunker had been detected. All radio traffic was concerning the team that was currently shooting their way through the main gate. As they approached an intersection in the tunnels, Beer faded against the wall. The team was scattered along the tunnel behind him with an interval of 10 feet. As Grey Eagle faded against the other wall, Davidson crouched low and crept forward to peer around the corner. "What's much do?" called a voice from the shadows. Davidson froze in place and slowly looked in that direction. "I say," said Davidson in his perfectly intoned British accent, "is this the way to the main complex?" As the German officer stepped out of the alcove, he raised his weapon toward Davidson. He never saw Beer step out of the shadows behind him, as if by magic. A massive hand wrapped around the man's face, covering his mouth and pulling his head to the left. The shocked guard released his hold on his weapon and reached for Beer's hand. Before he could grasp the massive wrist, Beer drove a knife down into the man's exposed throat and deep into his chest cavity, piercing a lung. With a savage twist of the knife, he brought it out and sliced through the carotid artery as he slashed up and out, and a fountain of blood erupted in an arc as Davidson deftly stepped back, avoiding the spray. Beer held the man as he felt the resistance grow weaker by the second as his blood flow diminished with each passing second. And when the body went slack, Beer dropped him and wiped his knife off on the man's shirt. Davidson and Grey Eagle checked the tunnel, but found no one else nearby. There was a small guard's outpost here at this junction, but it looked to be a place that wasn't normally manned. And with the attack on the compound, all stations would be staffed, ready to repel intruders. "Nicely done, lad," said Davidson, nodding approval at Beer. Beer nodded solemnly and returned his knife to its scabbard. Bringing his rifle back up to a ready position, they continued toward their objective. Grey Eagle glanced at Beer and understood the look on the man's face. How would a Lakota feel if it had been one of Custer's cursed 7th Cavalry that he'd just put a knife into? He understood Beer more than anyone else on the team. They were both from a people who had suffered greatly, and it marked them for all their lives. Moving up, Clark saw the fallen guard. For just a moment, his heart skipped when he thought it was Heinz. They looked a great deal alike, but once he was closer, he could see the difference. Also, there was no tattoo on his arm. Margolin leaned down and took a knife from the dead man's boot and smiled at Clark, who ignored him. As he started to kneel beside the body, the ground shook. 3 rapid explosions announced the arrival of the AC-130J Ghost Riders. They were targeting and eliminating the bunkers. Clark heard a crackle of static on his radio and then a partial garble of communication. "Last call, station, say again," said Clark. "You were badly broken." "All father to Thunder God," said Saunders. "Can you read me? Over." "Affirm," said Clark. "Looks like Ghost Rider punched us a hole. Over." "We've breached the perimeter," said Saunders. "Proceeding to secondary objective. Over." "Copy that," said Clark. "We're 15 minutes out. Over." "Understood," said Saunders. "Charlie Mike, see you on the other side. Out." "Contact front," shouted Grey Eagle. The roar of firearms filled the tunnel as the team did their best to take cover in the constraints of the tunnel. Most of them went prone. Ahead, Clark could see a squad of Germans moving their way, firing as they approached. Grey Eagle, Davidson, and Beard dropped to the ground and were returning fire, and that's when Clark heard the unmistakable sound of a minigun's motor spooling up to speed. Kodiak stepped out of the alcove where he'd pushed Rayan when the shooting started, and stepping into the center of the tunnel, he engaged the minigun. The roar of an enraged dragon seemed to fill the tunnel as Kodiak sent 5-second bursts into the group of Germans, killing 6 of the 10 instantly and sending the other 4 diving for cover. Clark instantly keyed up the German radio to squelch any call for help they'd tried to send out. Before the 4 German soldiers could get to their feet, Grey Eagle and Beer rushed forward. They quickly dispatched 2 of the others. Behind Clark, he heard 2 suppressed rifles go off almost simultaneously. Valkyrie and De La Cruz eliminated the remaining 2 with well-placed headshots. Clark glanced back but couldn't see either of the snipers due to the darkness in the tunnel. "Fuck me," he thought. "That's terrifying." "Tango's down," called Grey Eagle. "We're clear." Beer crouched down and took a keyboard from the pocket of the leader of the German squad. "Move," called Clark. "We've got a schedule to keep." They pushed farther up the tunnel for another half-mile before they came to a large intersection. There was a massive steel door on the right side of the hallway. There was also a parking area for several of the electric transport vehicles, with 4 vehicles sitting empty. Approaching the door, Clark looked at it closely before studying the map on his wrist computer. "Thunder God to Valhalla," said Clark. "We've reached Objective 2, over." "Copy, Thunder God," said Boudreaux. "Proceed with recovery. Don't waste too much time. If he's not there, move on, over." "Asgard Actual to Thunder God," interrupted General Dalton. "Priority 1 is to recover the asset. Make all attempts to locate and recover Bauer, over." "Copy that," said Clark. "Thunder God out." "What the fuck just happened?" asked Valkyrie, stepping out of the shadows and tapping her earpiece. "Looks like Boudreaux just got overruled by the general," said Clark. "That's odd." "How's that?" asked Valkyrie. "It's almost like Boudreaux wasn't concerned about recovering Bauer," said Clark. "The general has other plans. Either way, we've got to hurry. The last thing we want is for the others to get away while we're trying to find Bauer." "That's a good point," said Valkyrie. "Get that door open," said Clark, pointing. Beer and Grey Eagle started checking the door for a release mechanism, and after a moment, Grey Eagle motioned for Clark to come over. "I think I found some sort of keyboard reader," said Grey Eagle. "Try this, boss," said Margolin, handing Clark an ID card. "Where'd you get this?" asked Clark. "I found it on that fucker that Malachi gutted back in the tunnel," said Margolin. "Thought it might come in handy." Clark inserted the key card, and there was an audible beep followed by a clicking sound before the door began rumbling open. Clark motioned for everyone to move back, and he slipped to one side of the door. Once it rumbled all the way open, Clark peered inside and saw 9 large glass cylinders lining one wall with people inside. 6 were men and 3 were women. All were attached to oxygen masks and had numerous leads and tubes running to them. Clark slipped around the corner and entered the room. Nearly a dozen people were moving around in white lab coats while one older man sat at a desk and studied a computer display. Even without seeing the man's face, Clark knew who it was, and when he turned to see who had entered the room, Clark confirmed it. It was Joseph Mengele. "What's ist los?" asked Mengele, looking angry to be interrupted. Clark raised his rifle and pointed it at Mengele. "Move and you die," said Clark. Mengele didn't respond, but Clark could tell from his body language that he understood English. "Get this asshole in restraints," said Clark, motioning with his left hand. The muzzle of his rifle never moved a millimeter. Grey Eagle and Beer moved over and grabbed Mengele by both arms and put him into thick zip restraints with his hands behind his back. Beer looked like he would happily rip the older man's head off, but he said nothing. The seething hatred on his face was plain for all to see. Grey Eagle pulled Mengele roughly to his feet and began taking him toward the door, and Beer followed. One of the other scientists went for an alarm panel, and Margolin shot him in the neck. The man's legs buckled beneath him as he took one last step before collapsing into a pool of blood. "Manos arriba!" shouted Margolin. "They're German, not Spanish, you dumbass!" shouted Runestone. The scientists all put their hands in the air. "Well, whatever works," said Margolin. "See, they understood what I meant. Besides, I don't speak much German." Runestone rolled his eyes as the other team members began putting all the scientists into restraints. "Comply and you will not be shot," shouted Runestone. "If you move, you will die." "And for your cooperation," said Margolin, "I say donkey schlong." "That's Donka Shane," corrected Runestone. "I think I like his better," said Bedford. "Get them ready for transport," said Clark, heading for the glass cylinders. "The clock is running, folks." As he began inspecting the tubes, he saw Murdoch and Henderson fulfilling their orders by grabbing all the research notes and hard drives that they could find. "LeBlanc," shouted Clark, "I want charges on all of these tubes now. We can't let them hatch another generation of these shark things." LeBlanc took his kit out and started preparing incendiary charges. Clark located the one shark-like creature that had a tattoo of a trident on its arm. Clark knew this had to be Heinz and Bauer. The placard placed on the tank confirmed it. It read, "Heinz, Eric." "Help me get this open," shouted Clark. Shield Maiden ran over and helped him begin examining the controls. "I don't speak German," she said. "I do," said Clark. "Now what am I looking for?" "One that says purge or emergency release," she replied. "Something like that." Clark began examining the controls and found one that he was looking for, and then hit it without hesitation. "Wait," said Shield Maiden, but it was too late. The container began to hiss and the fluid began to drain onto the floor. That wasn't an issue since the floor was made of metal grating and had a large drainage basin beneath it. Seconds later, the tube lifted, and Heinz Bauer fell out. Clark caught him and kept him from striking the rough steel floor. "I've got you, man," said Clark. Shield Maiden started to move forward to check him when Bauer's eyes flicked open with an audible click. She gasped and jumped back. Before Clark could react, Bauer grabbed him and threw him across the room. Clark slammed into a bank of computers and shattered several screens. He grunted in pain, and he hit the floor and cut open his face and left arm on the jagged grating. All around the room, weapons were trained on Bauer. He was locked in a state between human and shark, but not fully either. He had webbed hands and feet, a shark-like snout, a shark's tail, and nictating lenses over his eyes. As he looked around, the look in his eyes was pure beast. There was no recognition there. Clark got to his feet with a groan and waved his hands. "Don't shoot," he ordered. "Let me try to reach him." Moving toward Bauer, Clark kept his hands open and palms outward, making no sudden movements. "It's okay," he kept softly repeating as he approached. "Crikey," said Margolin with an exaggerated Australian accent. "You all right, mate?" "Shut up, dumbass," said Valkyrie through her clenched teeth. "It's okay," repeated Clark, ignoring Margolin. He took a few more steps toward Bauer. "Oscar," said Clark, "it's Daniel Clark. Do you remember me?" Confusion crossed Bauer's face as he closed his eyes. "Oscar Bauer," said Clark. "Remember me? Oscar Bauer." Bauer opened his eyes and looked at Clark. "Clark," said Bauer through a mouth not designed for speaking. "That's right," said Clark. "I'm here to take you home." "Home," repeated Bauer. Beer picked Mengele up by the throat and slammed him against the wall. "Tell me how to help him or I'll crush your fucking throat," he hissed. "It's the green vial," wheezed Mengele. "It's on my desk. That will help him, but nothing can reverse the transformation now. It's far too late for that." Shield Maiden rushed over to the desk and found the green vial. It was next to an air gun that was designed to deliver shots using a pneumatic dart. She loaded the green vial and turned to face Bauer. He was still staring at Clark, confused and straining to gain some sort of control. She aimed and fired, striking Bauer in the middle of the stomach. Bauer snarled and started to take a step toward Clark when the shot began to take effect. His knees went out from under him and he collapsed to the ground. Clark caught him to keep his face from striking the steel grating. He eased him to the ground, and Clark watched as Bauer revered to human. He was unconscious, but breathing deeply. Clark grabbed a lab coat from a hook and wrapped it around Bauer. Nodding at Shield Maiden, she grabbed an emergency stretcher from the wall mount, and they rolled Bauer onto it. "Thunder God to Asgard," said Clark. "Package is secure. We have additional assets in custody. Over." "Solid copy, Thunder God," said Asgard. "Tasks Team 4 with getting them to the extraction point. Team 2 can Charlie Mike and proceed to your next objective. Over." "Copy that," said Clark. "Thunder God out." Clark looked around the room. "Team 4, he shouted. "Get the prisoners and this stretcher onto those vehicles outside and get to the rendezvous point. Team 2, let's move." Henderson sprang into action, coordinating the movement of prisoners and the wounded. And as soon as LeBlanc finished placing all the charges, Clark nodded toward him. "LeBlanc," said Clark, "go with Team 4. Blow this place as soon as we're clear." "Yes, sir," said LeBlanc. As they were heading out into the hallway, Beer fell into step next to Clark. "What are they going to do with the prisoners?" asked Beer, his deep voice rumbling low in the near darkness of the tunnel. "From what I was given to understand," said Clark, "once they've been debriefed, they're going to be turned over to the Israeli government for war crime trials." Beer looked at Clark for a long moment. "Thank you," said Beer. "You have no idea what this means to my people." "Well, don't thank me yet," said Clark. "We've still got a lot of others to stop before they find an escape route." Chapter 14, Aces High. 2100 hours, 15 May, beneath Inalco. Running down the tunnel, Clark could hear gunfire coming from multiple directions. As much as his instincts wanted to help his teammates that were engaged with the Germans, he had his own mission directive. "Thunder God to Allfather," Clark said into his mic. "Status update, over." "Thunder God, be advised we have encountered heavier resistance than expected," said Saunders. "We have yet to breach the manor house. We will not make the rendezvous. Over." Copy that, said Clark. We'll make do with what we have, over. Negative, said Saunders. I've retasked Team 2 from Team Orion. They're en route to your position, call sign Vindicator. Contact on alternate frequency, confirm with call sign and password, over. Copy that, said Clark. We'll have Runestone continue to monitor this frequency. I'm switching now to make contact, over. Affirm, Thunder God, said Saunders. Good luck, Allfather. Out. Clark changed the radio channel to the specified alternate frequency and checked for clear traffic, and finding no active communications, he keyed up. Thunder God to Vindicator, he said, pausing for a reply. There was a moment of static, and he heard a clear response. Copy, Thunder God, said a female voice. This is Vindicator. Authentication code 97 Alpha Tango 376 Bravo Echo, over. Identity confirmed, Vindicator, said Clark, glancing at his wrist computer. Authorization code Delta Sierra 355 November Golf 1 Niner 5, over. Copy that, Thunder God, said the voice. Identity confirmed. Be advised we have your approximate location and can rendezvous in 3 minutes at the next intersection, over. Understood, said Clark. See you there. Out. Clark looked over and made eye contact with Gideon. Get to the front and make sure our point men don't exchange friendly fire, said Clark, checking his wrist computer. Challenge and password. Password is Phoenix. Got it, said Gideon, heading quickly up the tunnel. Clark glanced around and did a quick head count of his team. And after a moment, he confirmed everyone was present and accounted for. Once that was done, he motioned for Valkyrie and De La Cruz to come over to him. They both moved up and leaned in near to him. Listen up, he whispered. Once we reach the next objective, we're going to come under heavy resistance. I want you two to hit the deck and start picking targets. Stick to the HVTs. Leave the rest to us. We can't afford to let any of these HVTs escape. We want them alive if possible. However, death is preferable to escape. Understood? Valkyrie nodded and De La Cruz grinned. I won't let you down, sir, said De La Cruz. Outstanding, said Clark. Let's move. After a few minutes, Clark heard Grey Eagle's voice up ahead. Halt, said Grey Eagle. Advance 1 to be recognized. Clark heard another voice. This is Sentinel, said a male voice, advancing. Clark began moving forward to double-check the exchange. As he crept forward, he saw Grey Eagle, Beer, and Murdoch were each on one knee with their weapons trained on one corridor. Clark saw a man emerge from the darkness of that tunnel. He was wearing wild hunt gear with a marine boonie hat on. His face was camouflaged and he had a full beard. He also noticed that the man was wearing a mechanical knee brace on the outside of his pants on his left leg. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Miller, said the man, codename Sentinel. Team Orion, password is Phoenix. Password confirmed, said Grey Eagle. Advance your team. Miller glanced back and made an exaggerated motion with his right arm, calling everyone forward. Moments later, the rest of the team moved into the intersection. Clark silently breathed a sigh of relief. The objective was going to be a tough fight for two teams, nearly impossible if they'd gone in alone. Stepping out, Clark glanced around. I'm Major Clark, he said, nodding to Gunny Miller. Guns, who's your CO? Well, that would be me, said a woman, stepping out of the crowd. I'm Captain Amelia Nyan, Vindicator if you prefer. Clark shook her hand. She was just a touch over 5 feet 4 inches tall and built like a distance runner. She was lithe and nimble with dark eyes and short black hair. She had a firm handshake and Clark instantly liked her. It's nice to meet you, said Clark. Likewise, Major, she said. You have quite a reputation with the teams. A good one, I hope, he replied. Some of it we're not sure it's true, she said. I have a bet going with my XO. Now he claims you and one of your men fought a group of Bigfoots using a Roman legion tactic with a sword and a shield. He's convinced it happened, but I'm skeptical. I promised him if we got the chance I'd ask you. Clark laughed and glanced around at her team. Most of the males had beards, and some of them quite thick and long. "I'll make you a deal," said Clark. "I'll tell you if you explain to me how your team gets to grow beards." "Well, that's a deal," she said. "Okay, yes, that happened," said Clark. "My first deployment with the team. We had a breach in the mimic unit, and Sergeant Major Gideon and I improvised to keep them out." "Shit," she said, shaking her head. "I guess I owe Skippy $50. "And the beards?" asked Clark. "They're approved by our commander," she replied. "Relaxed grooming standards so we can blend in where there are civilians around. Most of the encounters on the West Coast are in places that are full of people. Your team should qualify, too. The approval came from Asgard himself." "Well, I might have to look into that," replied Clark. "We'll have to continue this conversation later. We need to get moving." "Yes, sir," said Nyan. "Team 2, Orion is at your service." Clark integrated the teams and put his team in front and had Nyan bring up the rear. As they were passing, Clark stopped Gunny Miller. "Gunny, what happened to your leg?" "Fucking PLF went bad," said Miller. "Wrenched my knee and landed on a rock." "You should be at the Mimic getting that knee taken care of," said Clark. "Doc Avoletti wouldn't let you deploy like that." "I didn't go see the doc," said Miller. "One of our medics grabbed me a knee brace and I chased a handful of Motrin with a rip-it. I'll get it looked at when the mission is over. I'm not sitting this one out. Helping nail Hitler is the biggest shit I've ever done, and I helped hunt the Taliban in the Marines." "Fair enough, Gunny," said Clark. "As we say in the Army, fuck it, drive on." "Fido," said Miller, grinning. "That's my motto. I'll finish this if it kills me." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," said Clark. "Hoorah!" "Hoorah, sir," said Miller, heading off with the rest of his team. Clark turned around and locked eyes with Grey Eagle, and then gave him the signal to move out. Grey Eagle nodded once and turned, heading off into the dark tunnel. They were now moving farther away from the main complex and the rest of Team Odin. He'd never been into combat with anyone on Team Orion. But they were a certified wild hunt field team, and he knew they had the same training as his team did. He'd have to trust in that training. "Fuck, sir," said Margolin, falling into step beside Clark. "Did you see the beards on those guys? Some of them look like fucking lumberjacks. Goddamn surfers out on the West Coast. What the actual fuck?" "Well, it's not uncommon for special forces to be allowed to relax grooming standards in Afghanistan," said Clark. "I had a beard for most of my tour." "Yeah, well, that's different," said Margolin. "We're in the States. We had beards in the shit box because all the local men wore beards. It helped you not stand out. Why do they need 'em here?" "Have you ever been in a Starbucks coffee?" asked Clark. "No way, sir," said Margolin. "I don't go for that lumberjack beard, flannel shirt, skinny jeans wearing, man bun, bitch, vanilla bullshit things masquerading as coffee. I do see your point, though. I mean, they're stationed on the West Coast. That makes total sense. Thanks, sir." "Oh, I'm just here to help," said Clark. "Now get your game face on. We're less than a click from our objective. The feces are about to strike the pneumatic oscillator." "What?" asked Margolin. "He means the shit's about to hit the fan, dumbass," said Spinelli, Huntsman 210. That drew a few laughs from the crowd. "Game faces, people," said Clark. Ahead, Grey Eagle motioned for everyone to come to a halt. The signal was passed back and everyone took a knee. Grey Eagle approached the door, motioning for the others to stay back. Clark watched with his hand clenched on the handle of his rifle. Grey Eagle approached the door and used the key card he'd been given by Clark, and he swiped the access panel. It beeped and then flashed green, and Grey Eagle began opening the door slowly and gently. Since he couldn't use both hands, he pulled out the long-bladed knife that had been custom-made for him by the Mohawk twins who rode with the Hatamataneo. The door opened about 6 inches and Grey Eagle froze. He saw a guard coming up the stairs. He wasn't looking up from the noise. He was alone. Grey Eagle whistled softly and the man looked up with wide eyes. And with a snap of his wrist, Grey Eagle threw the knife, and it struck the man in the middle of his Adam's apple. The man's mouth opened and closed as he tried to scream, but both his vocal cords and his spinal cord were severed. He fell over backward and landed in a heap on the next landing down the stairs. And bringing his rifle up quickly, Grego began sweeping the stairway and looking down. He didn't see a sign of anyone coming, and he looked back and he motioned for the others to follow. And as he reached the body, he quickly recovered his knife and wiped the blood on the dead man's uniform. Murdoch picked up a rock and jammed it under the bottom edge of the door, blocking it open for the others. And then he shouldered his weapon and followed Grego into the stairwell. The rest of the team began to file by, and when Clark saw the dead man, inspiration struck. He looked around and found one of the Germans' GSG-9 personnel that had been assigned to his team. "Stabsverwiebelheit," said Clark in German. "Kommen Sie bitte." Hyde came down the last steps and stood rigidly at attention beside Clark. "Ciao, Herr Major," said Hyde. Clark gestured at the body. "I have an idea," said Clark. "Do you think you can fit in this man's uniform?" "He looks to be close to my size, sir," said Hyde. "I think so. What about the blood?" "I don't need you to wear it for long," said Clark. "Just long enough to buy us time to get through the fatal tunnel at the bottom of this staircase. All you need to do is stall them long enough for us to get in the room. Do you think you can do that?" "I think so, sir," said Hyde. "Good," said Clark. "Let's make it happen." While Hyde quickly stripped the dead man's clothes and gear, Clark reached for his radio. "Thunder God to Tyre," he said. "Go ahead," said Murdoch. "Hold at the door," said Clark. "Do not enter until I give the word." "Copy that," said Murdoch. Once Hyde had changed, Clark led him down the remaining steps to the metal door. There was some blood on the front of his uniform, but most of it was on the back where it had pooled beneath the dead soldier. Hopefully the Germans wouldn't notice it before they could act. Kneeling, Clark motioned for everyone to lean in that could. "On the other side of this door," whispered Clark, "is the underground hangar. There will be close to 50 German troops on the other side, maybe more. We know the HVTs are heading this way as soon as we breach the perimeter. I've been monitoring the command frequency. The Apaches still own the air, so we know nothing is lifted yet. That means the HVTs are inside waiting for the chance to escape. They'll be planning a move soon. They have to know we're closing in on them." There were solemn nods from the group. "Hyde will slip in and distract them," said Clark. "Otherwise, we're going to be cut to ribbons when we push through this doorway. It's a fatal funnel that we can't avoid. Hyde, once you're through the door, convince them that it's just you. And when they relax and lower their weapons, hit the deck and cover your ears. We're going to dump as many flashbangs through the door as we can and hit the room in force. We need to put down the Germans as fast as possible to prevent the HVTs from boarding the aircraft and fleeing. If they get clear of the Apaches, we'll never find them again." "Got it, boss," said Murdoch. "Do not fire on any of the aircraft," cautioned Clark. "If that aviation fuel goes up and catches the refueling tanks, everyone in this end of the compound dies, including us. It'll backflush fire up the tunnels and kill half our teams." "Gotcha," said Murdoch. "Don't shoot the planes." "That would be bad," said Margolin, grinning. "But what a fucking way to go. I mean, in a flash, your ass is in Valhalla. Fuck yeah." "I'd like to hold off on going to Valhalla for the foreseeable future," said Clark. "Fair enough, boss," said Margolin, sounding a little disappointed. "No shooting the planes." "Let's go," said Clark. "No mistakes. Flashbangs only. We can't afford to cook off those fuel tanks. Watch your fire. Make sure you're not shooting toward the fuel bunker. Selective fire and judicious marksmanship, folks. Now let's move." Hyde took the key card from Grego and nodded solemnly. He walked over to the door and he swiped it and pulled the door open. "Nicht schieben!" he shouted, stepping through the door. Clark heard the numerous bolts being pulled and released. "Wo sind die Amerikaner?" yelled a male voice. "We have them pinned down in the main house," replied Hyde. "That's good," said the voice. "We have lost communication." Clark listened for the go signal. Everyone near the door had flashbang grenades in their hands with pins already pulled. "Now!" screamed Hyde, dropping to the deck. "What's this loss?" shouted a voice. 9 flashbang grenades sailed through the door. Instantly, they all put their hands over their ears and closed their eyes, looking down and tucking their chins against their chests. After a moment that felt like an eternity, they heard as much as felt it. The flashbangs began detonating. There was a colossal bang followed by a nearly blinding flash of light that they could see through their tightly closed eyes. And as soon as it cleared, Clark grabbed his weapon and raced for the door. "Now!" he roared, bursting through the door and opening fire on the nearest group of disoriented German soldiers. As the rest of the team began pouring through the door, Clark could see that they were rapidly thinning the Germans, who were still recovering from the effects of the flashbangs. In seconds, the team had cleared the stairwell and were taking firing positions behind crates and equipment. Valkyrie and Scald dove behind a crate near Clark and began scanning the area. Clark glanced around for Hinderman and the others, and he didn't see them. However, what he did see was highly disturbing. A Junkers Ju-52 was already taxiing into the launch lanes of the underground runway. Ahead of it was 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, and Clark could see that Hinderman was piloting the lead aircraft personally. "Thunder Guide to Asgard," shouted Clark, trying to be heard over the firefight. "Troops in contact! Troops in contact! We've reached checkpoint 2. Be advised, aircraft are preparing to launch. Say again, aircraft are preparing to launch, over." "Asgard Control acknowledges, Thunder God," said a calm female voice. "Will advise all air assets to prepare a warm welcome, over." Clark looked at his wrist computer and saw that the Apaches were all moving into position over the lake. And just as they all came around to blockade the launch bay, Clark heard the captured radio crackle to life. "Alle Gülfün!" shouted a voice that Clark recognized as Hinderman/Hitler's. Clark felt the ground rumble. "Striker leader to base, we're taking heavy fire," shouted a voice on the command frequency. "Striker 22, 25, and 26 are down in the lake. We cannot stay here. We've got to—" The line filled with static and then went dead. "Striker leader, this is Asgard Control," said the calm female voice. "Can you advise, over?" There was no reply. "Overwatch to Asgard Control," said another voice. "All Apaches are down. Say again, all Apaches just got splashed in the fucking lake. We just lost our air support. It's those goddamn 88mm flat guns, over." "Fuck," hissed Clark. "They're gonna launch those aircraft. Cover me." He looked around frantically, and Clark saw that the team was beginning to push the Germans back and thinning their numbers rapidly. And below him, the floor of the launch bay was close to 30 feet down. There were more than a dozen aircraft sitting in alcoves. Most were transport planes. There were a couple of bombers. 6 were fighters, but only 1 was sitting pristine. The others were in various states of repair, and Clark's attention focused on the one perfect fighter. Sitting there waiting for him was a beautiful P-51 Mustang, gleaming like the day she had rolled off the assembly line. It had the original markings in place, and Hinderman was nothing if not a historical purist. It was painted in the pattern of the Shark Squadron, with the mouth full of teeth painted on the nose behind the propeller. Instantly, he knew that was their only shot at stopping Hinderman, if only it was full of fuel. "Cover me!" he shouted. "Got you!" shouted Clark. "Kodiak!" shouted Clark. Kodiak turned and headed toward Clark. "Get me on the deck," said Clark, pointing at the flight deck 30 feet below. Kodiak nodded and dropped his pack and weapon, and then the transformation began. It took only seconds as he transformed and Rayan transformed beside him, and with a roar, Kodiak scooped Clark up like a child and stepped off the platform. He hit the deck with a thunderous boom and sat Clark behind a crate, and when Rayan landed beside him, they exchanged glances and charged directly at a group of Germans that had taken position behind a large stack of crates. Using the diversion to his advantage, Clark sprinted across the flight deck to the P-51 Mustang, firing as he ran. Dropping his pack and body armor and rifle, he grabbed his radio and earpiece, and then he scrambled up the short ladder and climbed into the cockpit. Pulling the aluminum ladder from the side, he tossed it clear of the landing gear and slid the canopy shut. "Come on, baby," he said, beginning the startup sequence. There was a whine as the engine began turning over, and then a pop as the cylinders engaged. He feathered the fuel and choked, bringing the engine fully to life. Moments later, the engine was running smoothly and slowly coming up to temperature. And checking his gauges, he saw that he had a full tank. "Fuck yeah," he said, slipping his earpiece back into his ear and clipping the radio onto his belt. He began to taxi out of the alcove and toward the launch lanes, and as he was approaching, he saw Henderman go to full power and race down the runway. Immediately after Henderman, the other fighters left one by one. The Ju-52 was the last to lift. It was a transport, and Clark knew that the other members of Henderman's inner circle would be on board. Erwin Rommel, Wilhelm Canaris, Martin Bormann, and Karl Donitz. And possibly others were on that plane, and Clark knew he couldn't let them all escape. Justice was going to find them, and he was going to make sure it was going to happen today. As he began increasing speed toward the launch lanes, he glanced through the canopy and waved at Valkyrie and Vindicator, who were watching him from the platform. "Please tell me he's not married," said Vindicator, watching him speed away. "He is," replied Valkyrie, cocking her head slightly to the side as she saw Clark adjusting his controls. "It's too bad," said Vindicator. "Get in line," said Valkyrie as Clark throttled up and raced down the runway. "He can fly a plane from World War II, said Vindicator. "That is incredible." "You should hear him play the piano," said Valkyrie. Click the video on your screen for the next part of this audiobook. This has been Codename Wild Hunt, Operation Blood Eagle, written by D.A Roberts, read to you by Cameron Buckner. Print copyright by D.A Roberts. Audio production copyright by Cameron Buckner. Reproduction of this audio is prohibited in any form without written approval under the U.S. copyright laws. Stay tuned to the Dixiecryptid podcast for more full-length audiobooks.